Margaret wiped down the crystal glasses one more time, making sure each one sparkled under the bright lights of the dining room. The Whitmore mansion was buzzing with activity as the staff prepared for tonight's dinner party. She had been working here for 6 months now, and she knew how important these gatherings were to Mr. Charles Whitmore. Everything had to be perfect. The smell of roasted duck filled the air as the cook rushed around the kitchen, barking orders at the other staff. Margaret stayed focused on her tasks, polishing silverware and arranging flowers. She had learned to keep her head down and do her work without drawing attention to herself. That was the safest way to keep this job. As she moved through the grand parlor, dusting the expensive furniture, her eyes fell on the beautiful piano sitting in the corner. It was a stunning 1920s Steinway, its black surface so shiny she could see her reflection in it. Every time she cleaned around it, her fingers would itch to touch those keys. But she never dared. This piano wasn't for someone like her. "Margaret," Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's voice called from the hallway. "Could you please help me with the place cards in the dining room?" "Yes, ma'am," Margaret replied, quickly putting down her dustcloth. Mrs. Whitmore was different from her husband. While Mr. Whitmore barely looked at Margaret when he spoke to her, Mrs. Whitmore always used her name and said please and thank you. There was something sad in her eyes, though Margaret could never quite figure out what it was. As they arranged the fancy place cards around the long mahogany table, Mrs. Whitmore sighed. 20 guests tonight, she said quietly, all here to meet David. Margaret had seen Mr. David Whitmore many times. He was a quiet young man, always polite when he passed her in the hallways. Unlike his father, he would actually look at her and nod hello. She had heard the family discussing his future many times while she worked nearby. Mr. Whitmore was determined to find his son a proper wife from a good family. "He doesn't seem very excited about it," Margaret said softly. Then, immediately worried she had spoken out of turn, but Mrs. Whitmore just smiled sadly. "No, he's not. David has never been interested in any of the young ladies his father introduces him to, but Charles insists. He says it's time for David to settle down and take over the family business." The sound of expensive cars pulling up the circular driveway told them the guests were starting to arrive. Margaret quickly finished with the place cards and hurried back to her duties. Soon the house was filled with the chatter and laughter of wealthy families, all dressed in their finest clothes. Margaret stayed busy in the background, refilling drinks and clearing plates as the evening went on. She couldn't help but notice how uncomfortable Mr. David looked as his father introduced him to various young women. Each time, his smile seemed forced, and he would find excuses to step away from conversations. During the main course, she overheard Mr. Whitmore talking loudly to his guests. "David needs to understand his responsibilities," he was saying. "Marriage isn't just about feelings. It's about building the right connections, maintaining our family's position in society." One of the guest ladies, wearing more diamonds than Margaret had ever seen in one place, laughed. "Oh, Charles, you make it sound like a business deal." "In many ways it is," Mr. Whitmore replied seriously. "Love is a luxury we can't always afford. David will learn that soon enough." Margaret felt her heart sink a little for Mr. David. She couldn't imagine being forced to marry someone she didn't care about. As she cleared the soup bowls, she accidentally glanced toward the piano again. The beautiful instrument seemed to call to her, even in a room full of people. Mr. Whitmore noticed her glance and followed her gaze to the piano. A strange smile crossed his face, and Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen that look before. It usually meant trouble for someone like her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Whitmore suddenly announced, standing up with his wine glass in hand, "I have an interesting proposition for tonight's entertainment." The room grew quiet as all eyes turned to him. Margaret tried to slip away toward the kitchen, but he called out, "Wait right there, Margaret. This concerns you too." Her stomach dropped. She could feel all the wealthy guests staring at her now, some with curiosity, others with barely hidden disapproval. She had no choice but to stop and wait. Mr. Whitmore walked over to the piano, running his hand along its polished surface. "This piano belonged to my grandmother. She was quite the musician in her day. It's been in our family for over 40 years, and very few people have ever been worthy of playing it." He paused dramatically, clearly enjoying the attention from his audience. "I have a challenge for everyone here tonight. If anyone in this room can play Chopin's Ballad No. 1 perfectly on this piano, they can marry my son." The room erupted in nervous laughter. Some of the young ladies giggled and protested that they couldn't possibly play such a difficult piece. Others whispered among themselves about how impossible the challenge was. But Mr. Whitmore wasn't finished. His eyes found Margaret again, and that cruel smile grew wider. "I said anyone in this room, that includes the staff, even our maid here, is welcome to try." The laughter grew louder now, and Margaret felt her face burn with embarrassment. Some of the guests were looking at her like she was part of an amusing show. Others seemed shocked that Mr. Whitmore would even suggest such a thing. "Oh, Charles, you are terrible," one of the ladies called out, but she was laughing as she said it. "Can you imagine?" another guest whispered, not quite quietly enough. "As if she would even know what Chopin is." Margaret stood frozen in place, holding an empty serving tray in her trembling hands. Part of her wanted to run to the kitchen and hide, but another part of her, a part she had been keeping buried for years, felt something different. Anger, pride, and something else she hadn't felt in a long time, the urge to sit down at a piano and play. Mr. David looked mortified by his father's behavior. He started to say something, but Mr. Whitmore held up his hand. "Come now, David. It's all in good fun. Besides, what harm could there be? It's not as if anyone here could actually play such a challenging piece. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 is one of the most difficult piano compositions ever written. It requires years of training and natural talent that most people simply don't possess." Mrs. Whitmore was staring at her husband with an expression Margaret had never seen before. It wasn't the usual quiet acceptance. It was something much stronger. The room fell silent for a moment, waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret could feel everyone's eyes on her. Some guests were smirking, clearly expecting her to back down quietly. Others looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. Mr. Whitmore raised his wine glass again. "So what do you say? Any takers for my little challenge?" Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She thought about the years she had spent dreaming of playing piano again. She thought about all the time she had walked past this beautiful instrument wishing she could touch its keys just once. She thought about the way these people were looking at her, like she was nothing more than entertainment for their evening. And for the first time in 6 months of working in this house, Margaret Thompson made a decision that had nothing to do with keeping her job or staying invisible. She set down her serving tray on a nearby table and looked directly at Mr. Whitmore. "I accept your challenge, sir." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret had just accepted Mr. Whitmore's challenge, and now the entire room was staring at her in complete shock. Some guests had their mouths hanging open. Others were whispering furiously to each other behind their hands. Mr. Whitmore's face went through several different expressions in just a few seconds. First surprise, then amusement, and finally something that looked almost like anger. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to actually take him up on his cruel joke, especially not the black maid. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" he asked, his voice dripping with false politeness. Margaret's heart was racing, but she kept her voice steady. "I said I accept your challenge, sir. I would like to try playing the piece you mentioned." A few of the guests actually gasped. One elderly woman clutched her pearl necklace like Margaret had just announced she was planning to steal it. The young ladies who had been giggling before now looked confused and slightly offended that a servant would dare put herself forward in their company. Mr. Whitmore let out a loud laugh, but it wasn't a kind sound. "My dear girl, I don't think you understand. This isn't some simple church hymn or folk song. This is Chopin. Classical music. It requires years of proper training and education." "I understand, sir," Margaret replied quietly. She could feel her hands shaking, but she clasped them together to hide it. Mrs. Whitmore had been standing near the fireplace, but now she moved closer to her husband. "Charles," she said softly, "perhaps we should move on to dessert and coffee." But Mr. Whitmore waved her away. He was enjoying this too much to stop now. Margaret could see it in his eyes. He wanted to humiliate her in front of all these important people. He wanted to put her in her place and remind everyone exactly where that place was. No, no, Eleanor. The girl has accepted my challenge. It would be rude of me to back down now, wouldn't it? He turned to his guests with that same cruel smile. Besides, this should be quite entertaining. I'm curious to see what our maid thinks. Classical piano sounds like. More nervous laughter rippled through the room. Margaret felt like she might be sick, but she forced herself to take a step toward the piano. Then another. With each step, she could hear her father's voice in her memory, encouraging her during those long practice sessions years ago. "You have a gift, Margaret," he used to say. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that gift doesn't matter because of who you are or where you come from. Music doesn't care about any of that." When she reached the piano bench, Margaret paused. The beautiful instrument looked even more impressive up close. She could see her reflection in the polished black surface, and for a moment, she almost lost her nerve. What was she doing? These people would never accept her, no matter how well she played. But then she looked up and saw Mr. David watching her from across the room. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't smirking or whispering. He looked genuinely curious, maybe even hopeful. There was something in his expression that reminded her why she had loved music in the first place. Margaret sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. The feel of the piano bench beneath her was like coming home after a long journey. She had missed this more than she had allowed herself to realize. "Take your time," Mr. Whitmore said loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "I'm sure you'll want to think very carefully about what you're going to attempt to play." Margaret ignored him. She placed her hands on the keys and felt the familiar coolness of the ivory beneath her fingers. For just a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself remember. She remembered her father teaching her first scales. She remembered the scholarship audition that had changed her life. She remembered the dreams she had buried when life got in the way. When she opened her eyes, the room was completely silent. Even the whispers had stopped. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the room like water filling an empty glass. Soft and gentle at first, then building in complexity and emotion. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with a grace and confidence that seemed to transform her into a completely different person. The change in the room was immediate. The smirks disappeared from people's faces. The whispers stopped entirely. One by one, the guests leaned forward in their chairs, drawn in by the music in spite of themselves. Margaret lost herself in the piece. All the months of cleaning and serving and staying invisible melted away. This was who she really was. Not a maid, not someone to be looked down upon, but a musician. The music flowed through her like it had been waiting all this time to be set free. The ballad told a story, and Margaret told it perfectly. The gentle beginning gave way to passionate, dramatic passages that filled every corner of the grand room. Her hands flew across the keys during the technical sections, then slowed to draw out every note of the beautiful melodies. She played, with the kind of emotion that only comes from years of training combined with natural talent and deep love for the music. Mrs. Whitmore had tears in her eyes. She was standing perfectly still, her hand pressed to her heart as if the music was speaking directly to her soul. Some of the other guests looked like they had forgotten how to breathe. Mr. David had moved closer to the piano. He was watching Margaret's face as she played, and his expression had changed completely from the uncomfortable politeness he had shown all evening. Now he looked amazed, like he was seeing something he had never expected to find. Even the staff had stopped their work. The cook was standing in the doorway between the dining room and kitchen, a serving spoon still in her hand, listening with wonder to the music filling the house. As Margaret moved into the final section of the piece, the room seemed to hold its breath. The music built to its dramatic conclusion, each note clear and perfect. When the last notes faded away, the silence that followed was different from the silence that had come before. This wasn't the silence of people waiting to laugh. This was the silence of people who had just heard something extraordinary. Margaret kept her hands on the keys for a moment, letting the last echoes of the music fade completely. Then she looked up at the room full of people who had expected her to fail. The silence stretched on. And on. No one seemed to know what to say or do. Several guests were still staring at Margaret like they couldn't quite believe what they had just heard. Others were looking at Mr. Whitmore, waiting for his reaction. Mr. Whitmore's face had gone through several more changes during the performance. The cruel amusement had disappeared first, replaced by confusion, then surprise, then something that looked almost like panic. Now he just looked angry. Finally, Mr. David began to clap. Slowly at first, then faster. Mrs. Whitmore joined him, then a few of the guests. Soon most of the room was applauding, though many of them still looked shocked. Margaret stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling shaky. She had done it. She had played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 perfectly, just as Mr. Whitmore had challenged her to do. And everyone in the room knew it. Mr. Whitmore's face was getting redder by the second. This wasn't how his little joke was supposed to end. He was supposed to be laughing at her failure, not watching his guests applaud her success. "Well," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the applause. "That was, unexpected." Margaret waited. She had held up her end of the bargain. Now it was time to see if Mr. Whitmore was a man of his word. The applause was still echoing in the room when Mr. Whitmore's face turned a deep shade of red. He looked around at his guests, all of whom were staring at Margaret with expressions of amazement and respect. This was not how his evening was supposed to go. "Well, that was quite a performance," he said through gritted teeth, trying to force a smile. "Very impressive for someone who learned to play at church, I'm sure." Margaret remained standing beside the piano, her hands folded in front of her. She had done exactly what he asked, and now she was waiting to see what kind of man Charles Whitmore really was. One of the guests, an older gentleman with a gray mustache, spoke up. "Charles, that was extraordinary. I've heard professional pianists who couldn't play Chopin with that kind of skill and emotion." "Indeed," agreed one of the ladies. "Where on earth did you learn to play like that, my dear?" Margaret felt all eyes on her again, but this time it was different. Instead of looking at her like she was entertainment or something to be pitied, they were looking at her with genuine curiosity and respect. "I studied at Juilliard for 2 years, ma'am," Margaret said quietly. "I had to leave when my father became ill and could no longer work." The room fell silent again. Juilliard was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Everyone in this room knew that. To get into Juilliard meant Margaret wasn't just talented, she was exceptionally gifted. Mr. Whitmore's smile was getting more forced by the minute. "Well, yes, very nice, but of course my little challenge was just a bit of fun for the evening. Nothing serious, naturally." That's when Mr. David stepped forward. Throughout the entire evening he had been quiet and polite, going along with whatever his father wanted. But something had changed in his face during Margaret's performance. There was a strength there that hadn't been before. A gentleman's word. "Is his bond, father?" he said clearly so everyone in the room could hear. "Isn't that what you've always taught me?" The tension in the room suddenly became thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Whitmore stared at his son like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The guests looked back and forth between father and son, sensing drama but not quite sure what to do about it. "David," Mr. Whitmore said in a warning voice, "don't be ridiculous. This was obviously just entertainment for our guests." "You gave your word in front of everyone here," David continued, his voice getting stronger. "You said if anyone could play that piece perfectly, they could marry me. Margaret played it perfectly. Everyone here heard it." Mrs. Whitmore was watching her son with an expression of surprise and what looked like pride. Margaret had never seen her look at anyone in the family that way before. One of the young ladies who had been introduced to David earlier in the evening let out a small gasp. "Surely you can't be serious," she said. "She's the help." Margaret felt that familiar sting of shame, but before she could respond, Mrs. Whitmore spoke up. "She's a human being with an extraordinary gift," Mrs. Whitmore said firmly. "Something I think we all just witnessed." Mr. Whitmore looked like he was about to explode. His face was now purple with rage, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "This is absurd. I will not stand here and listen to this nonsense. "Margaret, get back to the kitchen immediately. The evening is over." But Margaret didn't move. For the first time in 6 months, she stood her ground. "With respect, sir, you made a public challenge. I met that challenge. Your son is right. A gentleman keeps his word." The room erupted in whispers. Some guests looked scandalized, others seemed fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. A few were already reaching for their coats, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Mr. Whitmore took a step toward Margaret, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You forget yourself, girl. I can have you thrown out of this house tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back. I can make sure you never work in this town again." That's when David moved to stand beside Margaret. "If she goes, I go with her." The words hit the room like thunder. Mrs. Whitmore gasped. Several guests stood up from their chairs. Mr. Whitmore looked like someone had just slapped him across the face. "What did you say?" Mr. Whitmore asked, his voice barely audible. David's voice was steady and calm. "I said if you throw Margaret out, I'm leaving too. Tonight. You would throw away everything for this girl you barely know?" David looked at Margaret for a long moment, then back at his father. "I would throw away everything to become the kind of man who keeps his word and treats people with dignity. The kind of man you taught me to be, Father, even if you seem to have forgotten those lessons yourself." Mrs. Whitmore moved closer to her son. "David's right, Charles. You did give your word, and that young woman has more talent and grace than anyone in this room." Mr. Whitmore whirled around to face his wife. Too, Eleanor? You're going to side with them against me?" "I'm siding with what's right," Mrs. Whitmore replied, her voice stronger than Margaret had ever heard it. "Something I should have done years ago." The guests were starting to leave now, some quietly slipping out the door, others making hurried excuses about early morning appointments. The evening was clearly over, and not in the way anyone had expected. As the room emptied, Mr. Whitmore, his wife, his son, and Margaret were left facing each other across the grand parlor. The beautiful piano sat silent in the corner, having started a chain of events that no one could have predicted. "This is not over," Mr. Whitmore said quietly, but his voice carried a threat that made Margaret's skin crawl. "If you think I'm going to let my family name be destroyed by this ridiculous situation, you're both mistaken." He turned and walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. "David, you have until tomorrow morning to come to your senses. Margaret, you're fired. I want you out of this house by sunrise." With that, he left the room, leaving the three of them standing in the sudden quiet. Mrs. Whitmore was the first to speak. "I'm sorry," she said to Margaret. "I'm sorry for my husband's behavior and for not speaking up sooner." Margaret nodded, feeling suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through her performance and the confrontation was wearing off, and the reality of her situation was starting to sink in. She had no job, no place to live, and she had probably made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in town. David was looking at her with concern. "Are you all right?" Margaret managed a small smile. "I'll be fine. I've been in difficult situations before." "No," David said firmly. "This isn't over. My father thinks he can bully people into doing what he wants, but he's wrong. I meant what I said. I'm not backing down." Mrs. Whitmore put her hand on her son's arm. "This won't be easy, David. Your father can be very vindictive when he doesn't get his way." "Then it's time someone stood up to him," David replied. "Starting with me." Margaret looked at both of them, feeling a mixture of gratitude and worry. She had started the evening as an invisible maid, and now she was at the center of a family crisis that could destroy all their lives. But as she looked at the piano one more time before leaving the room, she realized something important. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. The music had reminded her who she really was, and no amount of threats or intimidation could take that away from her. Margaret spent her last night in the Whitmore mansion packing her few belongings into a worn suitcase. She had saved most of her wages over the past 6 months, but it wasn't much. Enough for a few weeks in a boarding house, maybe a month if she was careful with her spending. As she folded her simple dresses, she could hear raised voices coming From downstairs. Mr. Whitmore and David had been arguing for hours, their voices carrying through the thick walls of the old house. She couldn't make out all the words, but she could hear the anger and disappointment in both their voices. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on her door. Margaret opened it to find Mrs. Whitmore standing in the hallway, still dressed in her evening gown but looking tired and older somehow. "May I come in?" Mrs. Whitmore asked quietly. Margaret stepped aside to let her enter. Mrs. Whitmore looked around the small room that had been Margaret's home for 6 months. It was plain but clean, with just a bed, a dresser, and a small chair by the window. "Wanted to apologize again," Mrs. Whitmore said, sitting down on the chair. "And I wanted to tell you something about myself that I've never told anyone else in this house." Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, curious. "When I was your age, I wanted to be a pianist too," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "I had some talent, though, nothing like what you showed tonight. My father forbade it, of course, said it wasn't proper for a young lady of my social standing to pursue music professionally, so I married Charles instead, like I was supposed to." She was quiet for a moment, staring out the small window at the dark grounds outside. "I've spent 30 years wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to follow my dreams, instead of doing what was expected of me. Tonight, watching you play, seeing David finally stand up for something he believes in, it reminded me of the person I used to be." Mrs. Whitmore reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "This is the name and address of a friend of mine in New York City. She runs a music school there. I've already written to her about you." Margaret took the envelope with shaking hands. "Mrs. Whitmore, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering. It's time I did something right for once." The next morning, Margaret left the Whitmore mansion just as the sun was rising. She had expected to leave alone, but David was waiting for her by the front gate with a suitcase of his own. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked. "I told you I meant what I said last night," David replied. "If you're leaving, I'm leaving too." "David, you can't throw your whole life away because of me. This is your family, your home." David looked back at the big house, then at Margaret. "My father gave me an ultimatum this morning. Forget about you and marry Victoria Ashford by Christmas, or he'll disown me and cut me off from the family money." Margaret felt her heart sink. "Then you should go back inside. You shouldn't have to choose between your family and someone you barely know." "But that's just it," David said softly. "Last night when you played that piano, it wasn't just the music that was beautiful. It was watching someone be completely true to who they are, no matter what anyone else thought. I've never been true to who I am, Margaret. I've spent my whole life trying to be the son my father wanted instead of the man I wanted to be." Over the next few weeks, Margaret found a small apartment in a different part of town and started giving piano lessons to neighborhood children. The pay wasn't much, but it was honest work doing something she loved. David rented a room nearby and started studying for the law school entrance exam. He had always been interested in civil rights law, but had never had the courage to pursue it. Mr. Whitmore, meanwhile, was busy trying to control the damage to his reputation. Word of what had happened at the dinner party had spread quickly through their social circle. Some people were scandalized that a black maid had dared to challenge her betters. Others were more critical of Mr. Whitmore himself, saying he had behaved poorly and should have honored his word. The worst part for Mr. Whitmore was that many people had started asking to hear Margaret play. Word of her talent was spreading, and several families had tried to hire her to perform at their own parties. Each invitation felt like another blow to his pride. 3 weeks after the dinner party, Margaret was teaching a piano lesson to a young girl when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a well-dressed black man she didn't recognize. "Miss Thompson?" "My name is Thomas Washington. I'm a music director at the Riverside Community Center. I heard about your performance at the Whitmore House, and I was wondering if you might be interested in giving a concert for our community." Margaret was surprised. "A concert? We've been trying to start a music program for our young people, but we need someone with real talent to inspire them, someone who can show them what's possible when you work hard and believe in yourself." Margaret thought about it for a moment. She had been keeping a low profile since leaving the Whitmore house, not wanting to cause any more trouble. but the idea of sharing music with young people who might not otherwise get the chance to hear it appealed to her. "I'd be honored," she said. The concert was held on a Saturday evening in the community center's small auditorium. Margaret had expected maybe 20 or 30 people, but when she arrived, the room was packed. Families filled every seat, and people were standing along the walls. She had never performed for an audience this large before. As she sat down at the old upright piano on the small stage, Margaret felt nervous for the first time since that night at the Whitmore house. But when she began to play, the nervousness melted away. She started with something familiar, a spiritual her father had taught her years ago. Then she moved into some classical pieces, including the Chopin that had started everything. But it was when she played a piece she had written herself, inspired by her own journey from dreams to disappointment to hope again, that the audience really came alive. When she finished, the applause went on for several minutes. After the concert, people crowded around to talk to her. Young people asked her about learning piano. Parents thanked her for inspiring their children. An elderly woman told her that her music had reminded her of her late husband, who had been a musician himself. As Margaret was packing up her sheet music, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the back of the room. David had been there, the whole time listening to her perform. "That was incredible," he said when he reached her. "You found your calling, haven't you?" Margaret smiled. "I think I'm starting to." "What about you? How are the law school preparations going?" "I got accepted," David said, grinning. "I start classes in the fall." They walked out of the community center together, talking about their plans for the future. Neither of them noticed the expensive car parked across the street or the man sitting inside it watching them leave. Mr. Whitmore had been following his son's activities for weeks, growing more frustrated every day. David seemed happier than he had ever been, and that only made his father angrier. But tonight, watching Margaret perform for all those people, seeing how they responded to her, Mr. Whitmore began to realize something that made him even more furious. His son had been right. Margaret Thompson was extraordinary, and he had let her slip through his fingers because of his own pride and prejudice. 6 months had passed since that memorable dinner party, and Margaret's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. Her piano lessons were booked weeks in advance, and she had been invited to perform at churches and community centers across the city. The small apartment that had seemed so humble at first now felt like home. David had started law school and was already making a name for himself as someone willing to take on difficult cases. He spent his evenings studying and his weekends helping. Margaret organized music programs for underprivileged children. Their friendship had grown into something deeper, built on shared values and mutual respect. But their happiness was about to be tested in a way neither of them expected. Margaret was getting ready for her biggest performance yet, a concert at the city's main concert hall to raise money for music education programs. It was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about during her Juilliard days, and now it was actually happening. As she practiced in her apartment that afternoon, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she was shocked to find Mrs. Whitmore standing there, looking nervous and uncomfortable. "Hello, Margaret," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. "May I come in? I have something important to tell you." Margaret stepped aside, confused but curious. Mrs. Whitmore had visited once before, but this felt different. There was an urgency in her manner that hadn't been there before. "It's about Charles," Mrs. Whitmore began once they were seated. "He's been different since you and David left. At first he was just angry, but lately he's been asking questions about you, about your performances, your students, your plans." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of questions?" "He's been trying to find ways to cause trouble for you. He's contacted some of the families whose children you teach, trying to convince them that you're not suitable. He's also been spreading rumors about tonight's concert." Margaret's heart sank. She had worked so hard to build her reputation, and the thought of Mr. Whitmore trying to destroy it made her feel sick. "There's more," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "He's hired a private investigator to look into your background. He's trying to find anything he can use against you." "But why?" Margaret asked. "I left his house. I stayed away from his family. What more does he want?" Mrs. Whitmore sighed. "I think he can't stand the fact that you and David are thriving without him. It makes him feel like he was wrong, and Charles has never been good at admitting he's wrong about anything." That evening, Margaret arrived at the concert hall 2 hours before her performance. She wanted extra time to practice and calm her nerves. But when she got to her dressing room, she found David waiting for her with a worried expression. "We have a problem," he said. "My father is here." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Here at the concert hall? He bought a block of tickets and brought some of his business associates. I think he's planning to cause some kind of scene." Margaret sat down heavily in the chair in front of her dressing room mirror. All those months of hard work, all the children who were counting on the money this concert would raise for their music programs, it could all be ruined by one vindictive man. "Maybe I should cancel," she said quietly. "Absolutely not," David said firmly. "You've worked too hard for this. Besides, there are 300 people out there who came to hear you play. You can't let my father's bullying stop you from doing what you love." There was another knock at the dressing room door. Margaret opened it to find the concert hall manager looking flustered. "Miss Thompson, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been a complaint about tonight's program. A gentleman is claiming that you don't have the proper credentials to perform here." Margaret and David exchanged looks. They both knew who that gentleman was. "What kind of credentials?" David asked. "He's demanding to see proof of your musical education and training. He's threatening to contact the newspapers if we proceed with the concert." Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. She had her Juilliard transcripts, but they only covered 2 years. Would that be enough to satisfy Mr. Whitmore's demands? "Give me 10 minutes, she said to the manager. "I'll come speak with him, myself." David started to protest, but Margaret held up her hand. "This has to end sometime. It might as well be tonight." They found Mr. Whitmore in the lobby, surrounded by several well-dressed men who Margaret recognized from that night at his house. He was speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm simply concerned about the reputation of this fine institution," he was saying. "We can't have just anyone claiming to be a professional musician without proper verification." When he saw Margaret approaching, his eyes lit up with satisfaction. "Ah, Miss Thompson, how convenient. I was just explaining to these gentlemen that there seemed to be some questions about your qualifications." Margaret looked around at the crowd that had gathered. She could see some of her students and their families watching with worry. She could see reporters who had come to cover the concert, now scribbling notes about the controversy. For a moment she felt that familiar urge to shrink away, to apologize and retreat. But then she remembered the children who would benefit from tonight's fundraiser. She remembered all the young people who had told her that her music inspired them to believe in themselves. "Mr. Whitmore," she said clearly, "I studied at Juilliard, School of Music, for 2 years before family circumstances required me to leave. I have performed professionally for community organizations across this city for the past 6 months. But more importantly, I have the respect and support of the people who have heard me play." "2 years?" Mr. Whitmore said with a cruel smile. "Hardly what one would call a complete education." That's when David stepped forward. "Actually, Father, I think there's something you should know about Margaret's background that you might find interesting." He pulled out a newspaper clipping from his jacket pocket. "This is from the New York Times, dated 3 years ago. It's a review of a concert featuring scholarship students from Juilliard. The critics specifically mentioned Margaret Thompson as a young pianist of exceptional promise with the technical skill and emotional depth of a future master." Mr. Whitmore's face went pale as David continued reading. "He called her performance transcendent and predicted she would be one of the important classical musicians of her generation." The crowd murmured with interest. Margaret stared at David in amazement. She had never seen that review. It had been published after she left New York. But David wasn't finished. "There's more, Father. I've done some research of my own. Did you know that the piece Margaret played at your dinner party, Chopin's Ballad No. 1, is considered one of the most difficult pieces in the classical piano repertoire? Did you know that most professional pianists won't attempt it in public because the risk of failure is so high? Mr. Whitmore was looking around nervously now. The crowd was listening to every word, and the reporters were writing furiously. The truth is, David continued, Margaret Thompson is exactly what that New York critic said she was, an exceptionally gifted musician. And instead of recognizing that gift, you've spent 6 months trying to destroy her career because you can't admit that a black woman played your precious piano better than anyone in your social circle ever could. The lobby fell completely silent. Margaret could hear her heart beating in the quiet. Finally, an elderly woman who had been standing nearby began to clap. Then another person joined her, and another. Soon the entire lobby was applauding, and Margaret realized they were applauding for her. Mr. Whitmore looked around at the crowd, his face red with embarrassment. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the concert hall, his associates following behind him. The concert that night was magical. Margaret played with more passion and joy than she ever had before. The audience gave her 3 standing ovations, and the fundraiser exceeded all expectations. After the performance, as Margaret was greeting well-wishers in the lobby, she saw a familiar figure standing near the exit. Mrs. Whitmore was there, smiling proudly. "That was beautiful," she said when Margaret reached her. "Your parents would have been so proud." "Thank you," Margaret said, "and thank you for warning me about tonight." Mrs. Whitmore glanced toward the door where her husband had left. "Charles will come around eventually. He's stubborn, but he's not stupid. Tonight showed him that you're going to succeed with or without his approval." 1 year later, Margaret was performing with the City Symphony Orchestra when she noticed 2 familiar faces in the audience. Mrs. Whitmore was there, as she had been for many of Margaret's concerts, but sitting beside her, looking uncomfortable but attentive, was Mr. Whitmore. After the performance, he approached her backstage. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. "That was very well done," he said finally. Margaret nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." He started to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, Miss Thompson, I was wrong. About you, about David, about what really matters in this world. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Margaret thought, a beginning is enough.